We begin with the revelation by former Homeland Security Secretary Tom Ridge. The top Bush administration officials pushed him to raise the terror threat level in the weekend just before the 2004 presidential election. Here was the scene that Friday before the election in 2004. Members of the Bush administration's national security team assembled to weigh the U.S. response to a new bin Laden videotape. Here's how Ridge described the meeting. Quote, "A vigorous, some might say dramatic discussion ensued. Ashcroft strongly urged an increase in the threat level and was supported by Rumsfeld. There was absolutely no support for that position within our department," that's Homeland Security. None. I wondered, is this about security or politics? Post-election analysis had demonstrated that a significant increase in the president's approval rating occurred in the days after we raised the threat level before. Ridge wrote, quote, "It seemed possible to me and to others around the table that something could be afoot other than simple concern about the country's safety." Well, the idea of raising the threat level was absolutely dropped ultimately, and Ridge said, quote, "I believe our strong interventions had pulled the go-up advocates back from the brink. But I consider that episode to be not only a dramatic moment in Washington's recent history, but another illustration of the intersection of politics, fear, credibility, and security. After that episode, I knew I had to follow through on my plans to leave the federal government." Wow. It's all in this new book. It's coming out in 2 weeks. We've got an advanced copy. I'm looking at it right now. Let's turn right now to Democratic Congressman Jim Moran of Virginia and Newsweek investigative reporter Michael Isikoff. Congressman Moran, you first. What does this say to you, reading this new book by Tom Ridge?
I continue to be proud that I consider myself a good friend of Tom Ridge's. He's a thoughtful, credible professional. I don't think the Bush administration deserved to have him among their ranks. And I do think that it was pretty obvious that they were politicizing these threat alert levels, as they were just about everything they did over the 8 years. It wasn't a matter of making the country particularly safer. It was a matter of improving Bush's poll numbers, and then eventually they overreached and undid themselves.
Mike Isikoff, you're an expert on conspiracies in this administration just passed. What do you make of these quotes? I mean, they're amazing quotes, and you know, when you write a book, as you know, you've written a bestseller, you take great care when you make accusations like this against your colleagues. Look at this. Is this about security or politics, he asked himself, sitting around the table. It seemed possible to me then, to others at the table, that something could be afoot other than simple concern for the country's safety. He's accusing his colleagues, Rumsfeld and Ashcroft, etc., of trying to hype something to help the president get reelected and to keep their jobs.
Well, look, the question he's raising there, was this about politics or security, was a question that everybody in the media and many people in government and politics were raising every time we went through the terror alerts during that period. If you just take a step back and you look at everything that was going on in 2004, I had a top Bush strategist who worked on that campaign who said last year, you know, that was a campaign we never should have won, an election we never should have won. Iraq was going south, escalating casualties, the revelations about Abu Ghraib, the revelations in the Senate Intelligence Committee about how the administration had stretched the intelligence in the run-up to the war in Iraq. The 9/11 Commission hearings showing how so many people inside the White House were asleep at the switch at the time that the president got the PDB, bin Laden, prepared to strike the U.S. What saved the election for George W. Bush in 2004? It was the threat of another terrorist attack and the continuous threat alerts. Now, that is simply, that was the view of inside the Bush campaign itself. It doesn't mean that there weren't genuine security fears during this time. There were, but because of the highly politicized atmosphere, because of the track record the Bush administration had demonstrated, particularly in the run-up to the war in Iraq, there were widespread suspicions as to whether or not these constant terror threat alerts were indeed genuine or whether they were influenced by politics.
And as Secretary Ridge points out in this brand new book, we've got the advanced copy of, every time they pushed that panic button and code orange went up, they knew they got more poll voltage out there. Let's take a look at the exit polls coming out of the 2004 presidential election that makes your point, Michael Isikoff. 19% of voters considered terrorism the most important issue, and of them, 86% This was a wipeout. This was a shutout, basically, for the president, 86-14 on that issue. So every time terror got into people's heads, it helped the president. Congressman Moran, it seems to me, I even saw another poll, you probably saw it back then, 49% of the country, just about half, said the only guy who could protect them was Bush. So every time that panic button went orange or red even, they gained.
But doesn't it remind you of that old story, the boy who cried wolf? There's only so many times you can do that, and then you lose your credibility. And that was Tom's concern. He wanted to maintain the credibility of his agency and of the professionals who were working in his agency. And he understood that as the White House politicized what they were doing, then when they do have a real alert, when it is an orange or red alert, then people are less likely to take it seriously. The country is less likely to respond. That was Tom's concern. And unfortunately, it clearly wasn't the White House's concern. Their concern was getting this guy reelected, regardless of the fact that they were undermining the credibility of the Department of Homeland Security and really threatening the real security of our nation.
Okay, let's take a look at this. In August of 2004, that's several months earlier than the election, the terror threat level was raised for 5 financial institutions in New York, Washington, and Newark, New Jersey. Here's what Tom Ridge said at the time when asked by skeptics about those who suspected that the threat level was being politicized. Let's listen to Secretary Ridge back in August of 2004.
I wish I could give them all the top secret clearances and let them review the information that some of us have the responsibility to review. We don't do politics in the Department of Homeland Security.
Mike Isikoff, we don't do it, but others in that cabinet room did. Here we have a new book out. I want you to give me a reading on this book. When you pick it up and you find these words, and you're reading it where he says, let's say, is this about security or politics? Then he answers his own question, says, I believe our strong intervention saved this from going ahead to this higher brink, but I consider this episode to be not only a dramatic moment in Washington's recent history, but another illustration of the intersection of politics, fear, credibility, and security. After this episode, I knew I had to follow through on my plans to leave the federal government. Well, pretty strong language. I had to quit after I saw the games that were being played.
It is, although I'm glad you played that clip from August of 2004, because I think a lot of us always thought that orange terror alert, which Tom Ridge totally endorsed, actually did as much to change the momentum of the election as any other single event. That came within days after the end of the Democratic convention. It totally stopped John Kerry's bounce, crushed his bounce coming out of that convention, and turned an election that Kerry at that point was ahead in the polls, was poised to win, and began the swing back towards